The summer of 1884 lay heavy on the Kansas frontier, the kind of heat that pressed down on a man's shoulders and made him speak less than he meant to. Mercy Ridge sat at the edge of where the wheat field gave way to open grass, a town of maybe 300 souls held together by a general store, a bank, a church, a boarding house, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when everyone knows everyone else's business and has decided what to do about it. The land was flat enough that you could see a rider coming from 2 miles off. There was no hiding in Mercy Ridge. Everything arrived in plain sight, and everything was judged before it reached the door. Jonas Pike stood at the stage stop on the eastern end of Main Street with his hat in his hands and a contract folded twice in his coat pocket. Beside him stood his son Matthew, 11 years old, arms crossed, jaw set in the way boys carry grief when no one has taught them how. His daughter Ellie, 6, held the hem of his coat with both fists and did not look at anything in particular. She had not looked at much in particular for nearly a year. Jonas had written to a placement agency in Kansas City the previous winter. He was not the first man in Mercy Ridge to do so, and he would not be the last. A widower with 2 children, 40 acres, and a house that had gone quiet in ways no amount of work could fix, understood certain things about necessity. He needed someone to keep the house, to cook, to sit at the table in the evenings so his children would not eat in silence every night until they forgot what a family sounded like. He had written it plain in his letter. No false promises. A practical arrangement between 2 people who needed something the world had not otherwise offered them. He had paid the agency fee. He had received a reply. A woman named Clara Voss, 27, from Missouri, experienced with children, willing to live on the frontier, no family to speak of, references available. He had agreed. Now the stage rolled in from the east, wheels cutting through the dust, and Jonas watched the door open and a woman step down into the Kansas morning. She wore a gray dress, worn at the cuffs. She carried a single bag, small enough that a man could lift it with one hand. Her hair was dark and pinned low. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, and they moved across the gathered faces of Mercy Ridge with the steadiness of someone who had already decided what kind of welcome to expect and had made her peace with it. She had not reached the boardwalk when the door of the boarding house burst open. Abigail Mercer did not lower her voice. She never had, and she had no intention of beginning now. She pointed at the woman in the gray dress, and she spoke loud enough for every soul on that street to hear. "Don't you let that woman into your house, Jonas Pike. She's been in prison. I know her face. Don't you bring that into a home with children?" The street went still. Matthew's jaw tightened. Ellie did not look up. Jonas stood with the contract in his hand and felt the weight of every eye on that street turned toward him, waiting to see what a man did when the ground gave out from under him. He was half a breath from turning away. Then Ellie moved. She stepped forward, not toward Jonas, not toward the stage. She moved toward the bag that had slipped from the woman's hand when Abigail spoke, and she crouched in the dust and picked up the small object that had fallen free. It was a Bible. Old, the cover worn to softness. Ellie turned it over in her small hands, opened it to the front page, and looked at the handwriting there. Her lips moved. And then, for the first time in 11 months, Ellie Pike made a sound that was a word. Mama's Bible. Jonas crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. He took the Bible from his daughter's hands with a gentleness that had nowhere to go. He looked at the inside cover, at the name written there in the handwriting he knew as well as his own face in a mirror, Rebecca Pike, and beneath it, in a different hand, smaller and less certain, a line he had never seen before. "If something happens to me, find Clara Voss. She knows the truth." He lifted his eyes to the woman standing in the street. Clara Voss met his gaze and did not look away. This is their story. A tale of a woman a town called Criminal, and the man who had to decide whether a piece of paper told him more about a person than her own 2 eyes. Now, Clara was not a woman who asked for sympathy. She had learned early that sympathy was a door that swung both ways, and the people who offered it most freely were often the ones most likely to shut it in your face when the wind changed. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a seamstress who died when Clara was 14. After that she had worked where work was offered, washing, cooking, mending, caring for other people's children in other people's houses. She was good at the work. She was better at reading the silences between people than at anything else, which was not a skill that earned you wages, but was the kind of knowledge that kept you alive in rooms where you had no power. At 19, she had taken a position in the household of the Whitcomb family in St. Joseph. It was a fine house with good china and bad windows that let the cold in all winter. Rebecca, then also 19, lived there as a poor relation, a cousin's daughter taken in out of obligation and kept with just enough comfort to prevent guilt. The two of them had been friends the way women are friends when they have no one else. Carefully, without ceremony, with a loyalty that did not announce itself but ran deep as a well shaft. Clara had seen Edward Mallory take the silver. She had watched him wrap it in cloth and pocket it on a Tuesday evening when the household was at supper, and he thought no one was in the hall. He was a lawyer, young and slick-mannered, who owed money in 3 counties and had decided the Whitcombs would never notice a missing tea set. He had noticed Clara noticing him. What followed was swift and not particularly complicated. A woman with no family, no money, and no standing in the world made an easy vessel for a lie. Clara was questioned. She denied. She was questioned again. Mallory had spoken to the right people first. By the time Rebecca tried to speak in her defense, the family had decided the matter and closed the door. Clara was convicted on the testimony of a man whose shoes cost more than she earned in a month. She spent 6 months in a women's correctional facility outside Jefferson City, in a room with 12 other women and a window that faced a wall. She did not cry for the first month. After that, she did not cry at all. There was no room for it, and more importantly, there was no use. When she was released, she had no address to return to. She had seen an advertisement in a Kansas newspaper, a widower with 2 children in Mercy Ridge. She had read the name Pike and felt her breath stop in her chest because Rebecca had taken the name Pike when she married. Clara did not know if it was the same woman. She told herself it was a common enough name. But she came anyway, and she brought the Bible Rebecca had pressed into her hands the last time they saw each other, in a doorway with snow on the ground. She had not known she was walking toward a town that already had a verdict prepared. She had only known she had nowhere else left to go. The road to the Pike farm ran northeast from Mercy Ridge, past a creek that was more gravel than water by August, and a stand of cottonwood that had survived 3 droughts by being too stubborn to die. Clara sat in the wagon bed with her bag across her knees. Matthew sat beside his father and did not speak. Ellie sat close enough to Clara's side that their shoulders touched, and that was all the welcome Clara needed to understand the shape of the situation. Jonas did not look at her directly for the first mile. When he spoke, his voice was level in the way a man's voice gets when he is working hard to keep it that way. "Where did you get Rebecca's Bible?" Clara told him the truth. Rebecca had pressed it into her hands in a doorway the last time they saw each other, in the winter before Rebecca left Missouri. She said to keep it. Said if there was ever a day Clara needed to prove she had once been trusted by someone in this world, that Bible would do it. Jonas was quiet. Then he said, "She never spoke your name to me." Clara looked out at the flat Kansas grass. There are things women learn not to say to the men who love them, not because the men aren't worth trusting, because experience has taught them the difference between a man who will believe them and a man who will mean to, and how much that difference can cost. The words landed hard, and Jonas did not answer them. But something in the line of his shoulders changed, and Clara noticed that the same way she noticed most things that were not said directly. The Pike farm was a modest place, solid, with a house built from good timber and a barn that needed a new roof on the south side. The fields were tended, which meant Jonas worked them himself, which meant he was not a man who had given up entirely whatever else he might be. Clara stepped down from the wagon and stood for a moment looking at the house. It was clean inside. That was the first thing she saw. Whatever Jonas had lost, he had not lost the habit of order, but it was a house where nothing had moved in a year. Rebecca's chair stood by the window at the same angle it had always stood. Her sewing box was on the shelf where she had left it. The apron hung on the hook behind the kitchen door, and something about the way it hung told Clara no one had touched it since the last time Rebecca had taken it off. Jonas stood in the doorway of the small room beside the kitchen. "You can stay here. Your meals are with us. You'll look after the children and the house." Clara set her bag down. He said, "I have conditions." She looked at him. "You don't tell the children to call you anything other than your name. You don't touch Rebecca's things. And you don't leave the property without telling me where you're going until I know what that Bible means." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll agree to 2 of those." Jonas looked at her. "I came out of a place with iron locks," she said. "I won't step into a marriage with soft ones." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Then Jonas said, "You can go where you need to. But if you leave before I understand why my wife wrote your name in her Bible, I'll come looking." Clara met his eyes. "This time," she said, "I'm the one looking too." The first days on the Pike farm were not easy, and Clara did not expect them to be. She had not come to Mercy Ridge in search of ease. She had come because the truth was here somewhere, buried in a dead woman's careful planning, and she meant to find it. She cooked from what was in the larder without complaint or comment. Beans and cornmeal and salt pork, the kind of meal that was honest about what it was. Ellie ate the whole bowl without being asked, which had not happened in weeks according to the way Jonas watched it happen. Clara said nothing about that. She cleared the table and washed the dishes and let the fact speak for itself. Matthew tested her on the 3rd morning. He knocked a full pail of water off the kitchen table, and the sound of it hitting the floor brought Jonas in from the yard. Matthew stood and looked at Clara with his arms crossed, waiting. Clara picked up the cloth from the counter and held it out to him. "In this house," she said, "whoever makes the mess cleans it up. That goes for me too." Matthew took the cloth and wiped the floor without speaking. He did not look grateful, but he did not throw the cloth back at her, which Clara counted as progress. She found Ellie's dress on the line that afternoon, a small calico thing with the side seam sewn crooked, the way a man might do it who was learning as he went. She took it down, sat by the window in the late afternoon light, and put the seam right with small, even stitches. She folded the dress and left it on the foot of Ellie's bed. She did not mention it to anyone. 2 evenings later she found Matthew's coat, the one he wore to school, with a long tear along the back panel where he had caught it on a fence nail. She sat up after the children were in bed and mended it, her needle moving in the low lamplight with the steadiness of long practice. When she held it up, she could see the place where the tear had been, but only just. She put it over the back of his chair and went to bed. The next morning Matthew put the coat on and looked at the repair for a long moment. He did not say anything to Clara, but Jonas, who had seen him look, met Clara's eyes across the table, and something passed between them that was not yet trust, but was the beginning of the road toward it. Ellie woke crying one night, or what passed for crying in a child who a decide sound cost too much. Clara heard her through the wall, the thin, quick breaths of a child who is grief-stricken in her sleep and cannot say so. She got up and went to Ellie's room and did not turn up the lamp. She sat down on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wood frame, and she began to talk quietly. She told Ellie about a bird she had known once. Not really known, she explained, but seen through the window of a building she had lived in for a time. A building with a small yard and a single tree. The bird had stopped singing in November, and Clara had watched it through the winter months, sitting on the branch in all the cold. In March it had begun again. Quietly at first, just a note or two, like it was remembering how. Ellie's breathing slowed. She reached out in the dark and rested her small hand against Clara's shoulder. Clara sat there until the breathing evened out into sleep. Then she sat a while longer, because the weight of that small hand was the first thing in a long time that felt like it might hold. Jonas stood in the hallway and did not move until Clara came out. He said nothing. But in the morning there was a cup of coffee on the kitchen table with the heat still in it, sitting where Clara would sit, and the fire was already built. That was his way of saying something he did not yet have words for. The town of Mercy Ridge was not going to be quiet about Clara Voss. That was simply not the nature of Mercy Ridge. Abigail Mercer made sure of that. At the Sunday service she spoke in the low, carrying voice of a woman who wants to be overheard while appearing not to intend it. She spoke of children left in the care of unknown persons. She spoke of the responsibilities of the community. She spoke of standards. Clara's name was not said directly, but it did not need to be. The wives of Mercy Ridge began to step around Clara at the general store. A woman who had asked her to mend a shirt left without it when she saw Clara inside. Matthew came home from school that week with a split lip and a silence about what had caused it. Clara understood from the set of his jaw that someone had said something about his father that Matthew had decided to answer with his fists. She found him in the barn that evening, sitting on a hay bale with a wet rag pressed to his mouth and his eyes fixed on the middle distance in the way boys look when they are trying not to feel what they are feeling. She sat down on the next bale. "You didn't do that for me," she said. "I know that." Matthew looked at her. "You did it because someone said something about your father, and you didn't know how to answer it without using your hands." Matthew did not deny it. "The trouble," Clara said, "is that they'll keep saying things, and you can't bleed your way out of a lie. I learned that." She was quiet a moment. "Tell your father. He'll say I shouldn't have fought. He might. But he'll also know what his son is up against, and he'll have to decide what he's going to do about it." Matthew looked at his hands. "Did someone say things about you," he asked, "when you were my age?" "Yes. What did you do?" "I got quiet," Clara said. "Stayed quiet long enough that I forgot how loud I used to be. I'm still trying to remember." The next afternoon, Jonas drove Clara and both children into town. He walked into the general store with Clara beside him. And when Abigail Mercer happened to be at the counter and happened to look away, Jonas stood in the middle of that store with the steadiness of a fence post and spoke in a voice that was not loud but carried. "Clara Voss is living under my roof. Anyone with something to say about her says it to me first." Abigail's mouth tightened. The store went quiet. Jonas bought what he came for and left. That evening, Clara put an extra cup on the table and poured Jonas his coffee without being asked. She did not say thank you, because what he had done was not the kind of thing you thanked a person for. It was just the right thing, which was its own category entirely. It was 3 days after that when Clara found the paper. She was doing what she always did in the evenings, what she had taken up quietly and without comment since she arrived. Finishing the mending Rebecca had left undone. There was a basket of it. Small repairs to shirts and curtains and a quilt, the ordinary accumulation of a household's wear and tear, things Rebecca had set aside meaning to come back to. Clara came back to them instead. She had told Jonas, the night he caught her at Rebecca's sewing box, that Rebecca had hated leaving an unfinished seam. It was true. She had remembered that from Missouri. Jonas had sat down then for the first time since Clara arrived and talked about his wife. Not the way a man talks to explain someone, but the way a man talks when the person is gone, and speaking about her is the only way left to hear her name out loud. Rebecca had hummed in the rain. She had hidden biscuits for Matthew in the bread drawer. She had fallen asleep in her chair so often that the cushion had shaped itself to her. Clara had listened without filling the silences. Jonas had not asked what she remembered about Rebecca from Missouri, and she had not offered it yet, because there were things between two women that belonged to them and needed to be handled carefully before they were handed to anyone else. But that evening, working through the mending basket, she found the paper tucked between the pages of the Bible in a place she had not looked before. It was thin, folded small, written in Rebecca's hand. It was a list of names, 6 of them, and beside one she had written a word that made Clara sit very still, Mallory. And beside that, in smaller letters, Elias Mercer, Mercy Ridge, same man. Clara held the paper in both hands for a long time. Then she got up and went to find Jonas. He was on the porch, as he often was in the evenings, looking out at the dark flat land in the way of a man who is not seeing what is in front of him. Clara sat down on the step below him, because that was the position that made the most sense for what she was about to say. She needed him to be able to look at her directly or look away, whichever he needed. And she needed to be a little below him because this was his house and his dead wife, and she was not going to forget that. She told him about Edward Mallory. She told him what she had seen in the hallway of the Whitcomb house and what had happened after, and the 6 months she had spent in a room with 12 other women and a window that faced a wall. She told him that the man who had arranged her conviction had come to Mercy Ridge and renamed himself, and that his name was now Elias Mercer, and that he owned the bank where Jonas kept his account and the land on which the church had been built. Jonas was quiet for a long time after she stopped talking. "She never told me," he said. "She was going to," Clara said. She was waiting until she had enough. He looked at the paper. "People like that," Clara said, "don't live in shadows. They buy the lanterns for the church. They make themselves so visible and so useful that no one would believe it of them." Jonas stood up and went inside. He was gone long enough that Clara was not sure what he would say when he came back. When he did come back, he sat down on the step beside her. "She went cold," he said. "When she heard the name Mercer for the first time, the day he came to introduce himself to the neighbors. I thought she was tired. She told me not to borrow from his bank. Did you ask her why? She said she had a feeling. I told her feelings weren't a reason to pass up fair terms. The silence was the kind that carries its own weight. I didn't know what she was carrying," Jonas said. "She knew you didn't." He looked at her. "That's not an accusation," Clara said. Rebecca was not the kind of woman who blamed the people she loved for not knowing what she hadn't told them. A week later, Matthew found them in the kitchen. He had been in the barn, he said. He had been in the barn a lot lately, which both of them understood meant he was working something out. He sat down at the table, and he told them what he remembered about the night his mother died. He had been awake because there was a noise, a voice he did not recognize, outside at the edge of the porch. His mother's voice, lower than he had ever heard it, the way she sounded when she was angry and making herself stay calm. He had looked through the gap in the shutter. It was dark. He could not see the man's face, but he could see the silver head of the man's walking stick because it caught the light from the inside lamp. Elias Mercer carried a silver-headed walking stick. Everyone in Mercy Ridge knew that. He remembered what his mother said. He did not remember it fully, but he remembered the shape of it. She had said a name, and she had said something about not letting the same thing happen to her house. 3 days later, she was sick. The doctor said Sutfoy. She didn't make it to spring. Matthew's voice did not break as he said this. He was 11 years old, and he sat at that table like a man, which was a terrible thing for a boy to have to do. Clara said, "You've been carrying that by yourself for a year." He nodded. "That is not a child's job," she said. "You couldn't have known what it meant. You still might not have it exactly right. But you did the right thing telling it." Matthew looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not hostility and was not yet warmth, but was perhaps the absence of the first and the beginning of the second. Jonas put his hand on his son's shoulder and left it there. The search of the old well was Jonas's idea. Clara had shown him the passage in the Bible, the line Rebecca had written in the margin of a page near the back. Clara had read it 3 times and thought it was grief talking, the way people who are afraid write things sideways. But Jonas had walked the property in his head and come up with something specific. The old well on the east side of the property had been dry for 2 years. Rebecca had used it to store things that needed to stay dry and cool. Jars, papers, anything that needed to be kept away from mice and the damp of the cellar. He had forgotten about it. He had forgotten about a lot of things. They found it on a Tuesday morning, all 4 of them, because Jonas had not thought to do it without the children. The well shaft was lined with flat stone, and at the bottom was a ledge. On the ledge, wrapped in oilcloth and then in a flour sack, was a tin box. Inside was everything Rebecca had gathered, a letter addressed to the county judge, sealed and ready, which she had never sent because she had not yet finished it. A copy of the court record from Clara's conviction, which she had written away for using a false name, and a story about doing research for a lawyer. The signature of Edward Mallory on a document that proved he had been present at the Whitcomb house during the time in question, and a small envelope containing a gray-white powder, wrapped carefully in wax paper, with a single sentence in Rebecca's writing, found in the sugar jar after he visited, kept it separate, and at the bottom of the box a silver coat button. The doctor who came out to look at the powder was a careful man named Hennessy, who had trained in St. Louis before coming west. He did not speculate out loud. But he looked at Jonas very steadily when he handed the envelope back and said there were substances that could cause a particular kind of respiratory deterioration in a person who was otherwise only mildly ill. He said it would require a proper inquiry to say anything definitive. He said it quietly with his hat in his hands and left. That night Mercer moved. He sent men to the farm. They came after midnight, and the wind from the south was high enough to cover sound. The first Jonas knew of it was Ellie screaming from the upstairs window, and by the time he reached the yard, the barn was already burning. Matthew had heard them before they reached the barn. He had been awake, as he often was, unable to sleep in the night since he told his story at the kitchen table, and he had seen from his window what was happening. He ran for the barn door. Clara was behind him before she had fully decided to move. The horses were in the back stalls, 3 of them, and one was Rebecca's mare, an old gray that Matthew had been feeding apples to every morning since he was 6 years old. Clara caught his shoulder at the door. "The hayloft is gone," she said. "She's in there. I know. Listen to me. Go in along the left wall, not through the middle. Keep low." He went, and she went with him, her arm over his shoulders, her body between him and the worst of the heat. The gray mare came out first because Clara got behind her and made enough noise to push her through instinct and toward the door. Matthew took her halter. They got out. A beam came down behind them. Jonas pulled them both clear of the doorway with his coat over his head and his hands burning. Ellie was in the yard. She had run from the house in her nightgown, and she was standing in the firelight calling her brother's name, loud and clear and full of breath, the way she had called it before any of this happened, before grief had taken her voice down to a whisper. Clara went to her and held her, and Ellie pressed her face into Clara's shoulder and held on with both arms. Later, when the fire had burned down and the horses were tied at the fence and Jonas was sitting on the porch with a wet cloth on his hands, Matthew came and sat beside him. He said, "I moved the box." Jonas looked at him. "I put it under the kitchen floor 2 days ago, behind the loose board. I didn't trust the barn." Jonas looked at his son for a long moment. Then he put his arm around him, burned hand and all, and did not speak for a while. Morning came, and Jonas did not wait for it to be fully light. He sent a rider to fetch Sheriff Amos Reed before the dew was off the grass. Reed came out to the farm, and he looked at the burned barn, and he looked at the tin box, and he sat at the kitchen table and read Rebecca's letter to the county judge. He was a man who had been in this town long enough to know how its foundations were laid, and who had laid them. He was a man who had made peace with that, or thought he had. He read the letter twice. He turned the silver button over in his fingers. He looked at Jonas, and he looked at Clara, and he looked at the children, and then he looked out the window at the barn. He said, "I'll need to send to the county seat." Jonas said, "I know it." Reed said, "Mercer has friends there." Jonas said, "He has friends here too," or he did. Amos Reed put his hat back on and stood up. He was old enough to be tired of making the easy choice and young enough to still be ashamed of it. He said, "I'll need a day to get the paperwork in order." Clara said, "Take what you need. We'll be here." The next morning was market day on Main Street, which meant most of Mercy Ridge was out of doors when Jonas Pike drove again in from the North Road with his 2 children beside him and Clara Voss on the bench at his side. Elias Mercer stood outside the bank in his good coat and his silver-headed walking stick, speaking to 2 men who held their hats politely and laughed at the right moments. He watched the wagon approach, and his face went the particular smooth, careful way of a man who is used to controlling what his face does. Clara stepped down from the wagon. Jonas stepped down on the other side. He stood beside her, not in front of her. That was important. This was not a thing he was doing for her. This was a thing they were doing together, which is a different thing entirely. Clara looked at the people of Mercy Ridge, and she spoke to them without raising her voice, because she had never needed to raise her voice to be heard by people who were paying attention. She told them the name Elias Mercer had been born with. She told them what had been done in a house in Missouri to a girl who had done nothing wrong. She told them what Rebecca Pike had found out and what Rebecca Pike had done about it, quietly and alone, in the months before she died. She told them about the tin box in the dry well and what was in it. She told them about a gray powder in a sugar jar. Abigail Mercer stepped forward from the crowd and said in a carrying voice that Clara Voss had a criminal record and that the word of a convict was worth nothing before the word of an established man. Jonas said, "A record is paper. The woman standing here is alive after 2 people spent considerable effort to make sure she wouldn't be." Mercer said nothing. He was calculating. He made his move toward the bank's back door, which Clara had expected. Matthew saw it first, because Matthew was watching for it, because Matthew had learned over the past weeks that watching for things was how you kept them from taking you by surprise. He called out. Sheriff Reed had come up on the far side of the street, quietly, with 2 deputies at his back. He had also, through the night, located the man who had been hired to set the fire, and that man had decided that Elias Mercer was worth considerably less to him as an employer than as a liability. Mercer was brought in. He said nothing useful. Men who have spent their lives arranging things know how to be silent when silence is all they have left. The county judge's ruling came 6 weeks later. It was read aloud by Sheriff Reed on the steps of the church on a Sunday morning, which was Amos Reed's idea, and which Clara understood was his way of making right what he had been too comfortable to make right before. Clara's conviction was vacated. Her name was removed from the record. The judge's order used the word wrongful, and that word was read aloud twice on the church steps, while the people of Mercy Ridge stood and listened to what the truth sounded like when it was spoken in their presence without being softened or qualified. A woman named Mrs. Calhoun, who had refused to collect her mended shirt from Clara's hands at the general store, stepped forward afterward and said she wanted to apologize. Clara looked at her. "Don't apologize for believing what you were given," Clara said. "Apologize for not thinking to ask whether there was something else to know." Then she turned and walked home. Not all wounds close clean. Clara knew that. She had learned it the way you learn most true things, through direct experience of the alternative. Justice was not the same as undoing. 6 months in a room with 12 other women could not be given back. The year Rebecca had spent alone with her secret could not be returned. Ellie's voice had come back, but it came back in small pieces and in its own time, and that was not something anyone had given her. That was something she had found herself. Jonas drove out to Rebecca's grave on the hill behind the north field. He brought the tin box and the Bible. He set them in the grass beside the marker, and he stood there for a while without speaking. Then he said, out loud, that she had done what she set out to do, that she had been heard, that the truth she had worked so hard to keep had gotten out. Ellie stood beside him and sang a few bars of something, a song Clara did not recognize that the children seemed to know from before. Jonas put his hand over his face. Clara stood back, near the fence, because this was not her moment, and she had learned to understand the difference between moments that belonged to her and moments that belonged to others. But Jonas turned and looked at her, and she understood, from the way he looked, that her being there was not an intrusion, that her being there was part of what he had come to say. She was not Rebecca. She was not a replacement. She was the person Rebecca had spent years trying to find a way to trust with the truth, and the person who had come here because the truth was the only thing she had ever wanted, and they had both found it together in a well on a Kansas farm in the middle of a dry summer. That was something. Clara had packed her bag on a Thursday, not to leave in defeat, but to leave correctly, which was a different thing. The contract between her and Jonas had been written for a different arrangement, and she was not willing to live in it any longer. She told him so plainly, standing in the kitchen with her bag at her feet. He said, I know. She said, I won't stay because you feel grateful. He reached into his coat and brought out an envelope, which he set on the table between them. Inside was money, carefully counted. He told her it was her wages for the weeks she had worked, and an additional sum that he said was payment for what his mistrust had cost her. She looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she took what she needed to rent a room above the milliner on Main Street and set up a small sign in the window. The sign said, Clara Voss, seamstress. At first the traffic was light, but word traveled as it always does in ways that cannot be planned. Clara's work was good, her stitches were even, her repairs were honest, her prices were fair. She did not ask questions that made people uncomfortable. She did not repeat what she heard. Women began to come, first for practical work, and then for the particular comfort of a room where they were not judged while they sat. Ellie came every Saturday morning with a scrap of cloth and sat at the work table and learned to make small, careful stitches. Matthew came with her and spent most of the time on the front step doing something with a piece of wood, which he claimed was not anything in particular, but which had gradually become a very tidy small box with a fitted lid. Jonas did not come often. He was careful about that. But every Monday early there was a bundle of firewood stacked against the outside wall of Clara's shop. He said, when she mentioned it, that he went past that way. She did not point out that he did not go past that way to reach any particular destination. One evening in late October, when the air had turned and the light was going earlier than it had any right to, she was locking the shop door when she turned and found him standing under the overhang, his coat wet at the shoulder from a light rain, holding the Bible in both hands. He said he had not come to talk about the past. He had come to ask about something else. She opened the door and let him in out of the rain. He set the Bible on her work table, and he stood for a moment looking at it. Rebecca wanted to plant apple trees, he said, on the east side of the property. She talked about it for 3 years. She had the spot picked out. He looked at Clara. I couldn't do it after she died. I couldn't put anything in the ground. Clara waited. 2 weeks ago I planted 10 trees, he said, young ones, from the nursery in Abilene. Outside the rain had picked up, steady and even against the window. I'm not telling you this because I want you to think well of me, Jonas said. I'm telling you because she's the reason I finally could, and you're the other reason, and I thought you should know both. Clara stood with her hands at her sides. He reached into his vest pocket and brought out a ring. It was plain and new, silver, and Clara could see from the color and weight of it that it had been made from something else, reclaimed, reshaped. He told her that it had been made from the silver of an old coat button, the one that had been his grandfather's, the one he had kept but never worn. He said, I'm not asking you to be anyone other than who you are. I'm not asking you to fill a house. I'm asking Clara Voss, who survived what should have ended her, if she wants to build something with me." Clara said, "What if I keep the shop?" he said. "Then I'll learn to eat supper later on busy days." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me again," she said. "Not because you paid a fee. Ask me because you mean it." He asked her again. She said yes. They married in the spring, beneath the apple trees, which were still too young to shade anyone but were trying. Ellie wore a dress Clara had made, blue calico with white edging, and she said every word of whatever she decided to say out loud that day with the full confidence of a child who had found her voice again and had no intention of being quiet. Matthew stood at his father's side with his arms at his sides and his face composed, a posture that belonged to a much older person and which Clara suspected he had practiced, and his eyes were red at the edges in the way of a person who is feeling something they have decided not to talk about. Sheriff Reed witnessed. A few neighbors came and stood at a respectful distance along the fence, not sure if they had been invited or were just passing, and Clara did not invite them closer but also did not send them away. Afterward, inside the house, Clara placed the Bible on the shelf in the front room. Not hidden, not displayed like a relic, just there on the shelf where books lived, between a farming almanac and a collection of hymns. It was not a ghost, it was not a chain, it was a woman's work, done carefully over years, finally finished. That evening the rain came back, soft and unhurried. Clara stood at the kitchen table, showing Ellie where to push the needle through the cloth and how to pull the thread without puckering. Matthew added wood to the stove. Jonas stood on the porch and looked out at the young trees in the gathering dark. Clara stepped out beside him. He said, "You think they'll take?" She looked at the small dark shapes of the trees in the wet grass, their bare branches fine against the low sky. She said, "If they make it through the first winter, they'll know how to hold on." He put his hand beside hers on the porch rail, and they stood that way as the rain fell. In the Kansas frontier, they said a court record could close a woman's life like a door. But what they did not say, and what Clara Voss had learned in the slow, hard years that had led her to a farm outside Mercy Ridge, was that a door can be reopened, not by mercy and not by forgiveness granted from above, but by the patient and sometimes costly work of truth spoken aloud in places where comfortable people would rather not hear it. Jonas Pike had paid a fee for a bride. What he received was something no contract had words for. A woman who had already paid a price he could not calculate, and who had not been broken by it, and who had come to his door not to be saved, but to finish what someone he had loved had started. Some debts run deeper than money, and some things planted in grief, tended honestly through seasons of frost and doubt, grow into exactly what they were always meant to be. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.